In 1901, a son was born to Edward and Caroline Romney Eyring in the colonies of northern Mexico. The boy, named Henry, grew up on horseback. When his prosperous family was driven from Mexico by revolution, Henry seemed fated to a life of hardscrabble farming. Fortunately, his parents had nurtured in him a love of learning and a strong work ethic. He graduated from Ila Academy and went on to the University of Arizona. By the time he was 30, he had already earned a PhD from the University of California and won international recognition as a theoretical chemist. He went on to become one of the noted chemists of the 20th century. More than a quarter century after his death, Dr. Henry Eyring's discoveries continue to illuminate the frontiers of scientific research.
We could go up to my office and I could show you modern textbooks that have been published within the last 3 or 4 years that still reference his work. There are lots of chemists over the past century or more that have done nice stuff in their day, and their achievements aren't recorded in current textbooks as frequently as his are.
Though Henry was repeatedly nominated for the Nobel Prize, he never won it. Yet time has revealed the true significance of his scientific contributions.
If I were to get together a room of 100 scientists, I would guarantee that 90 would know who he was, 50 would know why they knew who he was, and 100 out of 100 would know of his most major work, which was called the absolute rate theory. If I were to take that same group of 100 scientists and ask them who won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry this year, I bet 3 might get it. I wouldn't.
Henry's longtime friend and fellow University of Utah administrator Neil A. Maxwell often spoke of the value of having such a renowned scientist at the university.
He kidded them one time that the church should maybe send a bill to the University of Utah for $1 million, because how could they have gotten Henry Eyring to come out here to the University of Utah if it hadn't been that he had an affection for the church.
Henry Eyring wasn't noteworthy just for his scientific achievements. He was also a stalwart member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. For more than 20 years, he served on the church's General Sunday School Board. He was also uniquely outspoken in his conviction that science was a friend to faith. That conviction was the gift of his father, Ed, a humble farmer. The conversation they had before Henry left for the University of Arizona was dramatized in a 1960s-era church film called The Search for Truth.
So you're going to Tucson to study science, huh? Well, that's what you want, isn't it?
That's right, Dad.
Well, now, I don't know much about science, son, but I know quite a bit about some other things. I do know the Lord spoke to the prophet and that the gospel is true. I know our gospel believes in truth regardless of its source.
As he rose to scientific prominence, Henry became the church's informal spokesman for the compatibility of science and religion.
Likewise, Dr. Henry Eyring, Dean of the Graduate School at the University of Utah, and recently elected National President of the American Chemical Society, says,
"There is no doubt in my mind that God lives. I've had no serious difficulty in reconciling the truths of science with the truths of religion. Moreover, God has instilled in us a desire to search after the truth. I'm thankful that I belong to a church whose doctrines can be subjected to every test."
Henry's declarations sound familiar today, but to some in the 1950s, the advance of science seems spiritually threatening. On one occasion, Henry's wife's cousin, Elder Adam S. Benyon, a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, asked Henry to summarize his views on the apparent conflict between biblical and scientific statements about the creation of the earth and man. Henry wrote a letter to Elder Benyon. Before sending the letter, he asked one of his 3 sons, Hal, now President Henry B. Eyring, to review it.
And what's interesting is here I was, I may have been a college student by then, I forgot, at least I was totally, not a scholar. He let me read what he sent and said, "I want you to read this and see if it's sound." So here's this great Latter-day Saint scientist high priest asking his son, "You'll know if this is all right." And so I read it, looked fine to me. And he didn't know that it was going to be taken into a meeting of the 12. just at the time that President Joseph Fielding Smith had written the book Man, His Origin and Destiny, which was fairly negative towards many of the things that Dad just said that's the best scientific evidence is true. And so he invited Dad in. And when Dad came back from the interview, and I imagined that it was probably fairly confrontational, he said it was a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful conversation. He said, near the end, President Joseph Fielding said, you know, Henry, we ought to get together again sometime when you're not quite so excited. And so, you know, they'd had an interesting exchange, and I thought, oh dear, my father's in trouble, you know, forever with the brethren. Phone rang, and a voice came on the line, said, hello, this is David McKay. Is your father home? I said, no. Yeah. Oh, by the way, I've learned enough to know now that it's very rare that the president of the church places the phone call. So he obviously had dialed Dad's number, and I thought, oh boy, now I know we've got a problem. And it turned out that President McKay had called Dad to represent the church in Oklahoma at a university as the Latter-day Saint representative at a meeting on science and religion. So it was President McKay reaching out across to Dad and saying, you're okay, you know, we want you to be our representative.
One of the questions would be, you know, why didn't the brethren, why wouldn't they be worried about him? They're not worried because they knew he was absolutely faithful. They know that he is on their side 100%. And so if you go and meet with somebody and say, I think we shouldn't in our institute programs try to talk a lot about the age of the earth or evolution, leave it alone. Don't talk about things in that setting when they go across into their science classes across the street and hear things that will disturb them. Leave it alone.
Henry's optimistic message about the compatibility of science and faith ultimately sounded throughout the church. In the late 1960s, nearly 150,000 copies of his book, The Faith of a Scientist, were distributed. Many were read appreciatively by college-age members. A generation took comfort in the proposition that this church doesn't require you to believe anything that isn't true. Henry also shared his message of faith with fellow scientists. He became known among them as the Mormon Scientist.
You couldn't stop him. You know what I mean? It was just amusing. If he was talking to somebody, he'd want to find out their genealogy. That was the foothold that he'd get to begin with. But once he knew where the people came from, where their ancestors had come from and so forth, then he loved to talk about the church. I could get teary the way he could get teary telling that kind of a story. But I mean, he was excited about the gospel. He really believed it.
My father was like that. He was a scientist. He lectured to audiences in countries around the world. Once I read a talk he had given to a large scientific convention. In it, he referred to creation and a creator as he talked about his science. I knew that few, if any, in that audience would have shared his faith. So I said to him with wonder and admiration, Dad, you bore your testimony. He looked at me with surprise on his face and said, did I? He had not even known that he was being brave. He simply said what he knew was true. When he bore testimony, even those who rejected it knew it came not by design, but because it was part of him. He was what he was, wherever he was.